Shadows of devotion. James never believed in love at first sight, but when he met Margaret, everything changed. They were young, carefree, and their love seemed unstoppable. From the moment their eyes met at that summer wedding, it felt like fate. He had always been the reserved, logical type, but Margaret had this air of mystery about her that drew him in. Her charm, her beauty, her laughter. She was everything he never knew he needed. Their wedding day was a blur of happiness, the promise of forever in the air. They built a life together, filled with the usual things. Home, work, friends, and eventually children. James thought he had everything. A beautiful wife, 2 healthy kids, a stable job, and a circle of friends who admired them. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. It started with small things. Margaret became distant, a little colder. She spent more time away from home, always coming back with an excuse. Work, she would say. I'm just tired, darling. But James had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. He noticed the way her phone lit up at night with messages from unknown numbers, how she'd quickly lock the screen whenever he walked by. There were whispers at the dinner table when the kids weren't around, moments of silence when he would ask where she had been. Then came the night that changed everything. James had stayed late at work, finishing up a project that had kept him on his toes for weeks. It was around midnight when he finally arrived home, exhausted but satisfied. He expected to find Margaret asleep in their bed, as usual, but instead, he found her sitting on the couch, her face pale, eyes wide. She was staring at the TV but not really watching it. Something in the air felt wrong. "James," she said, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." His heart raced. He had no idea what she was going to say, but he knew it couldn't be good. "I've been seeing someone else," Margaret confessed, her words a blow to his chest. The world seemed to stop for a moment. The woman he had loved for so long, the one who had vowed to spend forever with him, was telling him that she had betrayed him. James stood frozen, not knowing how to respond. His mind raced, but his body felt numb. Margaret continued, her words spilling out in a rush. "It wasn't planned, James. It just happened. I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt you." She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. "But now I don't know what to do. I never expected it to go this far." The silence in the room was suffocating. James wanted to scream, to rage, but all he could do was stand there, his thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and betrayal. He had always trusted her, loved her with all his heart, and now it felt like that love had been shattered in an instant. But Margaret wasn't done. "The person I've been seeing. It's someone you know," she whispered, almost too quietly for him to hear. James leaned in, desperate to understand, his heart pounding in his ears. "It's Peter," she said. "Peter, their best friend." The man James had considered a brother. Peter had been there through everything, the good times, the bad times, and all the mundane moments in between. They had celebrated birthdays together, laughed over drinks, supported each other through loss and hardship. And now, Peter had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. James couldn't believe it. He was furious, devastated, and yet a part of him felt numb, like he had already accepted the reality of the situation. How could this happen? How could 2 people he loved so deeply destroy everything they had built? Margaret tried to explain, but the words sounded hollow, as if she herself was searching for a way to justify her actions. James barely listened. His mind was already racing toward the inevitable conclusion. This marriage was over. The next few weeks were a blur of tension and silence. James moved out of their shared bedroom, staying in the guest room while their children were away on a weekend trip with their grandparents. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. The anger, the betrayal, the confusion, they consumed him, and he couldn't make sense of it. One evening, after a long day of work, James went to a bar, his usual refuge when he needed to think. He wasn't surprised to see Peter there, sitting at the far end of the bar, nursing a drink. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, James felt a surge of hatred. How could Peter do this? How could he sleep with the woman James had loved so completely? Peter stood up and walked over to him, his face tense. "James, we need to talk." James shook his head, his fists clenched. "No, Peter. I don't think there's anything left to say. You've made your choice." Peter looked genuinely remorseful, and for a moment, James saw the man he once called a friend, the man who had always been there for him. "I made a mistake," Peter admitted, his voice low. "I never meant to hurt you. But it's not just Margaret. I've been lost for a while now. There are things I didn't understand about myself, about us." James felt the fury bubbling up again. But this time, it was different. There was something in Peter's eyes that made him stop. A realization crept in. There was more to this than just betrayal. Peter wasn't the only one who had been hiding things. James had his own secrets, his own regrets. "I don't know what to say," James muttered, staring at his drink. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." But Peter wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for understanding, for the chance to explain, to come to terms with his own demons. As the night wore on, James found himself torn between his anger and his empathy for Peter. He wasn't sure what was worse, the betrayal of his wife or the betrayal of his closest friend. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, James woke up with a heavy heart, the weight of the previous night's conversation still pressing on him. He went home, unsure of what to expect, but the house was empty. Margaret was gone. She had packed her things, left a note, and walked out of their life, leaving only silence in her wake. For weeks, James didn't hear from her. And then, one day, an unexpected message arrived. It was from Margaret. "I'm sorry, James," she wrote. "I've left, but I never stopped loving you. You were my everything, and I regret what I did. I didn't deserve you. It wasn't enough." James knew it wasn't enough, but it was the closure he had needed, the final piece to this shattered puzzle. The years passed. James and Peter drifted apart, their friendship forever tainted by the past. James moved on, remarried eventually, but the memories of Margaret and the betrayal never left him completely. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, he would find himself reflecting on what could have been, the love he had lost, and the choices he made. And sometimes he would wonder about Peter, and whether he, too, had ever truly found peace. But one thing James had learned through it all was that love, no matter how deep, could be torn apart by secrets and lies, leaving only the shadows of devotion behind.